What is up? Sean Kennel here with THiNK Media TV, helping you further, faster in media. Today, I'm here with Justin Wise, who is the Director of Monk Development and Co-Director of the Center for Church Communications Labs. Plus, he does a ton of social media stuff and other stuff at justinwise.net. Man, how's it going?
I am thrilled to be here, man. It's so good to talk with you and with your readers.
So today we're going to be talking about mainly kind of honing in on social media and a lot of the space that you've been in.
Yeah.
And we'll talk about, kind of metrics, like really studying social media's effectiveness, as well as, now it's 2012 and I'm thinking every year things change a little bit. In light of those changes, what are some of the best practices and how to respond and some of the other stuff? So let's just jump right into it. So you have done some research studying social media effectiveness. I love that because at times social media can seem like hype, yeah, or can get blown out of proportion. And at the end of the day, we really need to ask, man, is this like effective? Like, what is it actually doing? Is it actually, reaching the end user? What are some of your thoughts, some of your findings on that?
Well, there's a lot of noise out there with social media, particularly because it's such a new field, that there's a lot of people who are experimenting and trying things out and really trying to nail this thing down in terms of what works and what doesn't. So there's a lot of people who are earnestly trying to figure out, how do we measure our social media effectiveness? How do we see what works and what doesn't work? But there's also people who are kind of in the space just to be in the space. And so one of the things that we've tried to really look at is what is getting actual results for the people that we work with. And I will tell you that if social media were a person, it would be an 8-year-old. It would be an 8-year-old kid right now. So, picture that where you're an 8-year-old kid. You don't have a lot of things going for you. You're still fairly awkward. You don't know a lot about the world, and so you're still kind of finding and figuring things out for yourself. That's where the social media space is. But all that to say, one of the things that we have found that works extensively without fail is making your social media efforts about the people in your community. So in other words, to put that very simply, when you start making social media about yourself or about the organization, that's when you begin to lose folks. That's when, if you think about the analogy of going to a party, when you go to a party, who are the people you try avoiding at all costs? Well, they're the ones who are constantly talking about themselves. Whereas the folks that you really, jive with are the ones who tell you about themselves, but then they also show interest in who you are. And social media, organizationally or for an individual, is the exact same way. So if there's a trick, I guess you could say, to social media, it's making sure that your efforts are focused on the people who have chosen to be a part of your online community.
That's incredible. That's a great illustration. And with that, when talking about social media being effective, what are some of the ineffective practices or some of the ineffective things? Because even illustrating that, maybe even restate it, when we just start promoting our own stuff or we just start pushing our own stuff and becoming absorbed with the organization and not others. Yeah, what are some of the attributes kind of like, you're being ineffective when, or you're failing when?
We need like a Jeff Foxworthy, you're bad at social media if, right?
Yeah.
So there's a couple things to watch out for. And if you're doing these things, I used to charge pretty headlong into this type of stuff and basically say, if you're doing these things, you're a complete and total failure. That didn't go over so well because we found that a lot of people were trying and they're trying really hard. They just couldn't find traction. And so the last thing people need is to kind of be discouraged. You know what I
Beat
mean?
up, yeah.
So there's a couple things to watch out for. And, to start things off, if you can go through your social media channels, your social networks, and you can see that the content you're pushing out is, like we've mentioned already, if it's self-referential, there's a guy named Dan Zarella. He does some phenomenal work. He's a guy that I really enjoy reading. And he actually studies the science of social media. So there's a study that he did that showed a direct correlation between self-referential tweets and the number of followers. So he found statistically that the more you talk about yourself or your organization, the less followers you have, or the more unfollows that you get.
Wow.
Yeah, which blew me away. But I mean, again, going back to that party analogy, it makes total sense. So keep the references to yourself to a minimum. Chris Brogan is another guy that I enjoy reading. He says, adopt the 1 to 12 rule. So every time you talk about yourself, talk about something else for 12 updates or 12 posts.
Yeah.
That might be a little high for some organizations, but the point remains, don't make your social media all about you. It doesn't mean you can't talk about yourself. It just means keep it to a minimum. So that's number one. Number two is what we call the ghost town syndrome, where oftentimes what will happen is organizations and individuals will get excited about social media. It's the flashy, this is going to save our company or save our organization, or this is going to make me popular or a good author or, whatever. And so they charge headlong and they sign up for every social network that you can imagine. And before long, they start out really, really strong, but before long their networks go sometimes days, weeks, or even months between updates.
Right.
And so they enter into social media with no strategy. They have no strategy for content. They have no strategy for interaction. They have no strategy for the networks themselves. In other words, what are we as an organization or individuals, which ones are we going to embrace and which ones do we need to put aside and maybe pick up later on down the road, if at all? So there's, talking about yourself all the time. There's the ghost town syndrome. And then there's something else that we see all the time. It's basically a lack of buy-in from leadership. So we'll talk with people who are very, very frustrated, and I have these conversations quite frequently where there's an individual or a group of individuals who are excited about social media and they want to adopt it and incorporate it into their communications flow. Whether it's a for-profit, nonprofit, a church, a ministry, it doesn't matter. These types of individuals are usually excited about it and they want to incorporate it. But the thing they run into time and time again is that no one in their leadership realm, I guess you could say, no one there has buy-in. And that makes it really, really difficult to get any sort of momentum organizationally wide surrounding social media. So very quickly, if I were to say these are the things you probably want to steer clear of, those are the things that I would say. Make sure that you're not doing these things.
Awesome. Those are great. Okay, now we're doing this interview right at the beginning of 2012, and it seems like, things are moving incredibly fast in a number of fields, and that goes for social media too. And it seems like on the one hand, something becomes new, but and everyone jumps on, and it's kind of the new hype, but then eventually it can actually get bogged down a little bit, and you have to learn how to navigate through all the content, or you do wear out and you move off the platform. What are some very current kind of best practices to respond to the amount of increasing media noise for the end user, that, or maybe just getting so overwhelmed with so many tweets and so many advertisements and so much on Facebook, different kind of technology things to respond to, whether it's mobile becoming such a key thing now, and really needing to have a mobile strategy, or those kinds of cultural things, and then even just kind of family dynamic, or just in a church community, for specifically church communications. What are some of the things, current best practices to be aware of, maybe even pushing forward in 2012, that maybe have changed even over the last year?
That's a lot, man. You're throwing the kitchen sink at me here. Come on.
we do what we can. We do what we can.
So if I'm going to break that down into two parts, if I'm going to break that question down into two parts, there is the so the second half would be best practices for churches. But I think what I was hearing you ask before that was, how do you deal with all the noise? Is that fair?
Yep, sure.
Okay, so I'll hit those two questions and then see if there's any follow-up needed after that. But the first one, so you're absolutely right. There is just, there's just a barrage of information that we are exposed to day in, day out. And one of the studies that we reference quite frequently when we work with places is there was a study done by a research group, where they found that the average American 20 years ago was subjected to 3,000 marketing messages per day. That number has jumped to 5,000 messages in 2010. So in a 20-year span, we went from 3,000 messages to 5,000 messages per day, and that's probably now even more like 5,500. If you think about it, the average American is exposed to 5,500 marketing messages in one way, shape, or form per day. That's so many. But we all know it, we all feel it, we all sense it. And so there are a couple different ways that you can, at least in the social media world, in the social networking space, that you can cut down on that noise. And there's a couple things that I do personally that I have found to be incredibly helpful. And as we talk with organizations and churches and ministries, as they adopt these approaches, we're finding that the stress is cut drastically, because people have a plan to respond. So one of the things that we'll do is we have a content calendar. So we'll walk folks through building a content calendar for their organization, where we have four different time blocks. So one of the things we would hear over and over again is, we know that social media are important. We just don't have the time to do it. I'm sure you've heard this as well.
Yep.
And so we developed a strategy around that and said, okay, if you even have an hour per week, and who doesn't have an hour per week? You cut out 2 TV shows or whatever, and there's your hour. But if you have an hour per week, we can give you activity. We can give you a structure. We can give you a process to establish a social media presence and really deal with not only generating content, but also interacting with folks online. Social media, they're called social media for a reason, because they're social. Yeah. And, the social, denotes a two-way street. But we were just finding over and over again that folks were getting overwhelmed, not only with coming up with ideas to send out, but also just interacting with the sheer volume of information. So we said, if you have 1 hour a week, here are the things that you do. If you have 5 hours a week, here are the things that you do. If you have 10 hours a week, do these things. 20 hours a week, do these things.
Yeah.
So we have walked folks through that process, and to see their faces and to have, to hand them over a schedule on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, here are the things I'm going to do. It's as simple as saying, listen, you take 5 minutes, set an egg timer by your desk, take 5 minutes and respond to as many tweets as you can. And when that 5 minutes is up, you move on to the next activity, whatever it is. So something as simple as that, to saying, we're going to blog once per week, and we're going to come together as a leadership team and come up with topic ideas for the next 6 months, and we're going to assign authors for those blog posts for the next 6 months. And then when the 6 months are over, we're going to come around and do it again. So all that to say, what I'm getting at is one of the best ways to cut down on the clutter is by simply strategically thinking through what channels you want to be using, who you want to be reaching, the keywords that your organization is going to focus on. So, for a church, let's say, for a church in Las Vegas, let's say they hop on Twitter and they're going to concentrate on all the tweets within a 10-mile radius. Well, Twitter allows you to do that through their search tools, and they're not going to get overwhelmed. They're going to have a very clear, defined path that they can walk down. So I'm kind of dovetailing into the next part of this question, which is best practices for churches and ministries. And I'll back up real quick, though, and say that there are tools that you can use to help plan. So a couple of the tools that I use on a daily basis, one is called Buffer app. Buffer, like you buffer, or I don't know.
Yeah.
What's something you buffer? I can't even think now.
Well, are you thinking buffer like a car? Because I buff after I wax. Or are you thinking buffering like loading the video?
Oh, this got out of hand real quick. Yeah, so that term, buffer, like buffer, you have buffering. I'm saying buffer way too much. All I'd say, go to bufferapp.com. And what Buffer app will do is allow you to throw in your social media credentials, so your Twitter and your Facebook, and then it will, based on the number of people you have in your network, it will pre-select times to post when you're going to receive the most amount of viewers. It's a phenomenal service. It takes the guesswork out. It's free up to a point, so it's a freemium model. They do charge, but only once you get to a certain point. It's a fantastic service, and that's something that I use daily to schedule tweets out, so I don't have to think through, oh my gosh, when am I going to send this out, that out, blah, blah, blah. There's another tool that I use. It's called ift.com, ifttt.com, and it's a phenomenal service that automates a lot of tasks for you, and I use it heavily for social media. So when I'm reading, let's say, an RSS feed in my Google Reader, if I star a post, ift will tell Buffer to add that star post to the Buffer app. It's just something that I found recently, but it's really, really helpful. And you can really mix and match and do some custom stuff there. So it's ifttt.com. So all that to say, moving into best practices for churches, one of the things that when we work with churches, the very first thing we do is say, what is your vision? What is your mission? And we tell folks, you can't say the gospel. You can't say that, because that's like, the standard Sunday school answer. And what happens is, unfortunately, a lot of churches and ministries never take the time to come up with their unique calling as a church. And so they spin their wheels a lot. And so they adopt this kind of generalist, vague mission, and they put a mission statement in the church bulletin that no one reads and no one knows. And so one of the things that we get people to do is focus and dial in on developing a specific mission and vision for their church. And from there, you're going to weave that into every single thread of what you do as an organization, but certainly into what you do as a church or ministry on the social web. So the example that I like to use is, there was a church here locally in town in Des Moines here that focuses very specifically on adoption. So they found out through a lot of different kind of weird circumstances that a lot of the people in their church were either adopted or had adopted children. And just through a lot of different things, they centered on this sense that God was calling them to be this adopting church. And so now, everything they do as a church really revolves around that. So they hold classes for parents who are expecting to adopt. So they say, here's what you can expect in the first year of having your adopted child, this kind of thing. And we help them move that online to the point where they have now become really an authority online about adoption. And folks come far and wide to their website, to their blog, to find out about adoption. And that was because they knew their vision, they knew their mission. So that's the first thing that we do. And if you don't know your mission as a church, then don't bother with social media, because it'll just confuse you. It will create frustration, and you won't get the results that you want. So that's square one. And then the last thing I'll mention about best practices, so I'm kind of going from one end of the spectrum to the far other end of the spectrum. I don't know why I feel the need to share this particular part, but there is a transition happening in leadership right now in the church, where you have the boomer generation that is now beginning to enter retirement, and then you have the millennial generation that is now beginning to take positions of leadership in churches, established churches specifically. Mm-hmm. And there is a tension there that I think is just inherent amongst any sort of generational transition, but there's also an added tension because the methods that these two generations communicate are so drastically different. So what we ask senior leadership to do is say, listen, you don't have to do social media. You don't have to drive the social media strategy for your church yourself. So, and if you're not going to drive it yourself, you need to allow someone else who knows this medium, who knows it. You need to allow them, you need to give them the authority, and you need to buy in to what they're doing. And then, of course, we show them statistics and figures and this, that, and the other of how a younger generation communicates. And, of course, as you know, it's almost entirely based online or digitally in some way, shape, or form.
Right.
So that, I think, is key for a church to understand, that you as the senior pastor, if I could talk just to senior leaders, as a senior pastor, as a senior leader, you don't need to be the one driving the ship. If that feels like a burden to you, if that feels like a weight to you, you don't have to do it. But I would say you need to give the authority to someone within your organization. You need to give them the authority to drive that ship. So I think that answers the question. But to kind of sum up, know what your unique calling is. I mean, this is basic stuff, but people need to be reminded of it. Know what your basic calling is. And then if you are not in the social media space and you don't want to be and you don't get it, then deputize, I guess is the word, somebody who does get it, and resource them, not just with money, but with your buy-in and with your encouragement.
Love it. And that last thing you were talking about as far as kind of appointing someone in the organization, I've heard it often as being a major trend in established churches of, in a way, a new position being created, whether it's the pastor of communications or whether it's the chief communications officer, the COs in organizations or businesses, or the brand voice of an organization. Is that kind of the position that you're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, it can have, you're picking on the gist of it. I mean, it can, those positions, they have, some of them have really succinct and clear titles. Some of them have goofy titles. Yeah. And for goodness sake, if you're going to create a position in your organization surrounding social media, don't call that person a social media ninja. It's just a pet peeve of mine. I see it and I just cringe. I cringe because there's so much good work that can be done with social media. There's so much power behind it. And then you get these goofy titles, and it totally erases any legitimacy to the position.
Do you think that any position, though, can be called a ninja? Because now that you mention it, I actually am hoping that at some point I could get that added on to my title. But anyways.
Now, if you carry around throwing stars and a sword and you dice up people for fun, man, rock that ninja title all day long.
By all means.
Or if you were on the movie, if you were in the movie Three Little Ninjas, which was my favorite movie growing up, then you call yourself a ninja. Otherwise, Leave it at home.
Good.
You know what I'm saying?
Okay, last couple things is just rapid fire. What are a few for you? You mentioned a few names, a couple blogs you read. What are some of the resources, blogs, books, apps, conferences that you really recommend for getting specifically maybe church communications and those in positions in churches, ministries, nonprofits to embrace over this next year to maybe have a year of education, learning, going to the next level in this space?
Yeah, so because I have it pulled up, I'll go through my Google Reader real quickly. Some couple no misses. Number one on my list would probably be, oh gosh, who would I put first here? I would say Social Media Examiner is a site that I don't miss very often. Socialmediaexaminer.com is one. Mm-hmm. He's not specifically targeted towards social media, but his insights really drift along the line of shaping a culture from a brand perspective. That guy's Ben Arment. So benarment.com is a guy I listen to a lot. Of course, you have Seth Godin, although I did tweet the other day that sometimes I have no idea what Seth Godin is talking about. I'm totally clueless sometimes. I'm like, bro, you are like on a different planet right now. I have no idea what that means. Anyway, yeah, he's consistently good. Another guy is Michael Hyatt. So I help moderate some of the comments over at michaelhyatt.com. But he's just got a really practical approach to helping people understand social media and its effect and its power. So I think he's a good, consistent voice. There's daily blog tips, which I enjoy. A guy I mentioned earlier, Dan Zarella. That's with a Z, 2 R's, 2 L's. HubSpot is another resource that I go to, hubspot.com. But in terms of people I follow on Twitter, I'm going to pull up my no-miss list here. Of course, if you're not already, make sure you follow THiNK International, right?
Yeah, that's a must. I mean, humbly stated, probably one of the premier Twitter accounts on the... That's actually, though, after we start applying, talking about ourselves a lot less and actually interacting with the community more. So we have a brighter future, and our past is in the past.
I love it. So anyhow, aside from THiNK International, I love Business Insider. There's another guy named Dan Haydon, Haydon. He's actually specifically targeted towards nonprofits. Matter of fact, I think his moniker is like the social media nonprofit guy. He's got some really good thoughts, specifically into the nonprofit world. But actually, the Buffer app is the service I mentioned earlier, but they have a fantastic Twitter account that I'm just consistently I feel like I retweet them all the time. But they're on Twitter at Buffer app. Who else do I really enjoy? Yeah, Mashable is another one that's a given.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, those are the basics.
And books, conferences?
So I know you and I were talking about this earlier, but if you're interested at all in this type of thing, especially for the church and nonprofit world, you got to go to Echo Conference. You just got to be there. That's where this type of mentality and mindset is really fed and encouraged and nourished. Not to sound too goofy, but the folks at Echo really understand media, and they understand what it takes to do media well in the church space. So, Echo is a given. There's a conference that I just started going to, the Social Media Analytics Conference. It's a little dry. It's not church-based, but it really is some heavy hitters talking about how to measure social media. And that's put on by the guys at Business Insider. I'm trying to think of what else, the conferences I've been to that really nourish this. Oh, the one I just went to a couple months ago, and I'll be back in February, is NRB, National Religious Broadcasters. They're really intentionally focusing on, and this is what I really appreciate about them, is their willingness to transcend and bridge that gap that I was talking about earlier between the generations. And so they've intentionally sowed into that field and really said, hey, young people, we want to learn from you, and we want you to show us how to incorporate social media into our, traditional media approaches. So those are guys that I really appreciate and look towards. Actually, another guy just came up on my list here is a guy named Brian Elaine. He puts on a conference called the Killer Tribes Conference. Great guy, great content. Really knows his stuff backwards and forwards. I know I'm forgetting like 100 different people, but those are the folks that I can think of off the top of my head.
Love it. That'll be a great place for people to start, just kind of begin to dive in. And now, and actually really the most important question when it comes to resources is, where's your stuff at? And I realized that THiNK's Twitter is actually second to the Justin Wise Twitter. But no, you're putting stuff out and stuff. So your blog, do you have any email newsletter or anything that people can get plugged in with?
Yeah, so you can pretty much find anything you want that I do at justinwise.net, justinwise.net. You can find my Twitter there. Of course, if you want to follow me directly on Twitter, it's just at justinwise. But I got a newsletter. It's on justinwise.net. And we do resources, tips, tricks, giveaways, that type of thing. Also, I would love it if your readers checked out our blog at Monk Development. So it's monkdevelopment.com/blog. And we really try and focus in on what it means to be in the church and nonprofit world, but also do social media well. So that's really what our content is focused on. So there's a couple different ways. And of course, you can get to that blog from justinwise.net. But yeah, pretty much anything that folks want to find out about me or the resources that I'm able to put out, just head to justinwise.net.
Perfect. Well, Justin, thanks so much for spending some time with THiNK Media TV here.
You bet. My pleasure.
THiNK Media TV, helping you move further, faster in media.
People who talk on it. We'll turn them off. I'm talking with Sean. Leave me alone. Okay, anyway, sorry, I just put that on Do Not Disturb. So anyhow, what I was talking about was...
It's one throne, and this is not my seat. Syntax is terrific, just warming the beat.